Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So I'll just introduce myself and our speakers. My name is Lucy Truman. I'm the Managing Director of Truman Change, and this is one of our change chats that we do every sort of 6 to 8 weeks or so, which we started, and I can see there are some familiar names and faces, so I think some of you have joined previous ones as well. But we started doing these in the first lockdown when it became very clear that there was an awful lot of organisational change happening in a very different way to what it has happened previously. And we wanted to just kind of start the conversation of capturing what some of that learning might be and how it might be to do organisational change going forward in a post-COVID world in a different way based on all the lessons learned. And we did a lot of research, we had a lot of these conversations, we had a lot of interviews with public sector leaders to really understand what is the difference about the change that happened during the pandemic compared to the change that happened before. And we came up with a series of themes, patterns that we saw that people kept talking about over and over again. And one of those themes was around kind of humanity, in that people, organisations sort of stripped out a lot of the hierarchy that they had before, and people worked together as human beings in a much more people-focused way to really make change happen, and not so much relied on some of the traditional project program management processes around change that we've heavily relied on prior to the pandemic. So we think that's a really key thing going forward. We think something around breaking down those barriers, being authentic, understanding emotions, taking care of individuals. We think that's really important going forward. And so we wanted to hold a session specifically on that. And we have 2 brilliant speakers at the moment. We have a third one joining us who unfortunately has had a power outage just before the call and is waiting for a Wi-Fi to reboot. So hopefully Laura will be joining us soon, and I will introduce her as soon as she does, as soon as she joins the call. So we have David Rogers with us. David is head of comms in communication and engagement in the Pennine, Lancashire clinical commissioning groups, which serve East Lancashire and Blackburn with Darwen, which is my patch. I live in Blackburn with Darwen. David, but also has a kind of outside of work interesting take on this as well, in that he's an avid yogi. Is that the right word, David?
That's right. I'm a yoga teacher, so I teach classes in Pennine Lancs, and I think I like to think I practice what I preach. So it's not just twisty bendy, it's about the philosophy of yoga, and hopefully I can bring that into the chat.
That would be lovely, thank you. And we also have Carolyn Wright. Carolyn and I have spoken a number of times during the pandemic, and actually Carolyn's been a speaker on one of our events before. Carolyn's the head of people and OD at the Lake District National Park, who have obviously had to be extremely responsive to all of the different changes in rules and regulations, and been heavily impacted by the pandemic like most organisations have. So she'll be sharing with us her perspective on how that's been for her organisation. And Laura, who's hopefully joining us very soon, is a professional coach who specialises in wellbeing, resilience, meditation. So she very much works with people on an individual level. So I'm sure she'll bring a very interesting perspective there on working with individual peoples as opposed to organisations. So these, if you've joined us before, you'll know they're very informal. Do feel free to drop any questions in the chat. We don't have anything scripted. It is just a kind of reflection piece. So please do feel free to get involved in the conversation. We do record the sessions, but we only record the faces of the speakers, so you don't have to worry about whether you are on screen or not. And we just do that so we can put it on YouTube afterwards, because people sometimes can't make the time, but they do want to listen back to the sessions afterwards. So, David, shall I start with you? So, given that kind of overall introduction, we all got a bit more human during the pandemic. What are your reflections?
Wow. Well, I have this phrase that I often think about, which is about remembering the soul of our work. What brings us to work? What brings us to make the changes that we want to make, to be the people we want to be? And I think you described right at the beginning about process and processes and hierarchies and structures. And you didn't mention the B word, but I'll mention it anyway, bureaucracy. And I think an awful lot of people just, and I think we all do, and I'm no sort of paragon of virtue here. I think we all tend to sort of get bogged down in all of that stuff. And we lose sight of, I think, who we are. And I think we lose sight of who everyone else is. And the connections that we make with people become increasingly fragile. And I think what happened in the pandemic is that was like a massive magnifying glass to all of that. You put people on a video, MS Teams or Zoom conference and chat, people begin to focus in on stuff much more. There's more time to reflect. You've not got the structures generally if you're working from home or hybrid working, and you've not got those structures, those hierarchies, those bureaucracies. The pandemic itself brought a kind of can-do attitude and need to do things quickly, which cut through all of that. And I think that's hopefully brought us back to the soul of who we are, helped us perhaps balance a little bit. And there are some challenges that people face working from home, I have no doubt about that. Shift a little bit or balance between do, and be. And I think the balance of doing and being is quite an interesting and important one when we talk about our humanity. The more you be, the more you can do, but the more you do, the less you be. That's one of my kind of mantras, really. And I think that's my initial reflections anyway.
That's really interesting, because actually when Carolyn and I caught up this week, we were talking about the difference between, capacity from a time point of view and the tasks you've got to do, but also capacity from a headspace point of view, and how often we sacrifice the headspace. And actually when we force ourselves to have the headspace, we somehow find that we manage to get more done. Carolyn, do you want to add what are your initial first reflections?
Yeah, I think that for me, there was something about giving people the permission to be really creative and kind of work beyond their roles. And I think when we had a conversation earlier this week, Lucy, we talked, didn't we, about how we saw a bit more of the person beyond the role. I think often in local authorities and local government, we're very fixated on roles and hierarchies, and we don't often look beyond the role to the person and their wider experience. And often there's a wealth of experience. In my organisation in particular, we're a national park. We are a local authority, so that's our governance setting, but we're a national park, and we have business elements as well. We've got our businesses and our visitor centres and our TICs and things, tourist information centres. But a lot of people have joined us because they're looking for a lifestyle change. And so they've got a rich career history behind them, and we don't always kind of interrogate that and recognise that. And I think the pandemic gave us, we all had to be all hands on deck. And that gave us the flexibility to see people bringing some of those other skill sets into their work and feeling more relaxed about sharing elements. I think there's something around permission to fail. We didn't have any right answers, so we just had to try things and see what worked. And that was incredibly liberating. And one of the things I really valued about that time was that we were able to give people in different roles around the organisation a chance to really step up and flourish. It didn't always have to be the director of such and such. It could be somebody who was working at a kind of first line manager level, but who had expertise. For example, I'm responsible for volunteering in our organisation. So I have a volunteering team leader underneath me. Chris was empowered to just go out and do what he needed to do to get volunteers out into the park, managing the visitor numbers, doing the education piece. I didn't need to sit on all those boards and meetings he sat on with external agencies. He did that himself. He got that all moving. And that was brilliant because he's got the skill set. But in previous times, it probably would have taken me and possibly the director I sit under to get a multi-agency agreement together, and we'd have had lots of long-winded conversations. And actually, we just got things working. So I think those were the things that I'm really keen to take forward. Maybe less emphasis around where is your level within the organisation, and more about what's the whole picture that people are bringing to work with them, and how can we get them using that in their work, because it's immensely rewarding for people, and it just helps with that relationship between organisation and individual. I think if you feel recognised for your whole experience and background, you're going to be putting a lot more in.
Can I just come in there? I thought the permission to be creative was absolutely spot on. I think that going back to Lucy's initial point about, you know, the hierarchy, the process, the procedures, our bogged downness in all that, that kind of permission to be creative got lost, I think, in that. And actually, one of the great benefits, as you say, was that benefit of people just taking risks and daring to do stuff that perhaps, as you would say, would have gone through 3 or 4 committees, required a lot of paperwork. And some of the time, we just didn't have the time for that. So I think that's a really powerful point. And it's something from a comms perspective that we found very, 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 very valuable. We used to have a command and control structure, and that just went. So, yeah. Sorry about that, Lucy.
No, not at all. I think for me that sort of reduction in process was particularly fascinating, because my background prior to Truman Change was very much kind of project and program management. And I'm not saying for one second that I didn't learn a lot from the art of applying some structure to something. I think that is really important. But I do find it interesting how that is a whole kind of industry which was founded in engineering and construction and then heavily adopted by IT. And Prince, which is a very popular methodology, stands for projects in a controlled environment. So it's a whole methodology that was designed around controlling the environment and things being fixed. So we've got, you know, this much to spend, we've got this much time to do it in. And whilst there's some importance in bringing that level of structure into particularly big organisational change programmes, actually people and humans and behaviour are not a controlled environment. So when you're leading a change that does require people to fundamentally change their behaviour or how they work or how they relate to their colleagues and their customers or residents, I don't think that is necessarily the right way to go. And there is something about applying just enough structure without burdening it. And I think because of the time and the pressure during the pandemic, that was the approach that had to be taken. Every bit of structure that was put in, the starting point had to be, do we really need this? Because it might slow us down, as opposed to, right, we've got this methodology and we're going to squeeze everything into it. Curious to know your reflections, both of you, on that kind of how you get that balance right.
Yeah, because it is about balance, isn't it? And I think that I didn't know that about Prince, that C stands for control, because there's little that's controlled about people, really, isn't there? People are an uncertain element in any change process. And I think there's something really important about giving people space to feel uncertain and voice that concern and voice the concerns within processes, and understanding that you will have to flex if you're moving through change to allow that. But certainly, I mean, I remember back in probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I was going to conferences and people were talking about VUCA environments, so volatile, uncertain, changing, and I can't remember what the A stands for. And they were saying, look, this is the new reality. And then we got thrown into a pandemic 6 years later, and it feels like it's never really settled down yet, and maybe it's not going to. And there's something about balance in terms of we can't always work with no structure, without any structure. We've got governance commitments that we have to fulfill. It can be incredibly stressful for people as well to work with that. It can be very liberating, but we've got to recognise that for some people it's quite stressful as well. So we've got to find a balance between the two, and that's going to be the challenging piece, to take the best of what we've had in operation over the pandemic and take that forward to kind of influence that balanced, to reach a balanced position that takes the best of both worlds, really.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of build on that, because I think one of the things for me is we tend to, probably not OD professionals, but I think generally we tend to forget that people come to work with a whole history, don't they? They come to work with their cognitive biases, their affective biases, their kind of conditioning, their habits, you know. And I think that sort of appearance at work, we tend to think people would appear at work ready to get on and do, but actually, and that's right and proper, but we tend to forget all the other stuff that's going on. So the human side of the interactions were magnified for me, I think, in the pandemic, because people began to see the classic situation of hybrid working, as you'd see a cat walking across someone's screen, but even newscasters had little toddlers walking in, didn't they? And sort of suddenly we realize that people have lives beyond their role and their work, and they kind of, and actually it's messy. And I'm a great fan of Sean and Argyris. You know, they talk about, Argyris talks about, I think, the messiness of real world, and institutions and organizations are set up to help and support people in that messiness. But what happens is they get bogged down in all that stuff that Lucy and that we've talked about. But there was something for me about this humanity that was anchored in the pandemic, and it was kind of, people began to check in with people much more. There was much more of recognizing that a lot of people were working remotely. It was recognizing that perhaps people needed to be, are you okay? Now in an office, I'm not sure that would happen unless, thinking back to the past, unless someone started ranting or perhaps bursting into tears. It would be very visible emotional reactions, I think, and people would say, are you okay? But now I think it's almost, I feel it's almost more of a default. Alongside that care for each other, we're in danger of losing that, as always, I think. But alongside that care for each other, there's a recognition of the power and importance of people being vulnerable. Vulnerability and honesty are really, really important in change, in projects and whatever. But everyone, this cognitive biases that I just touched on, all our conditioning, a lot of people, I think, operate in freeze, flight and fear mode a lot of the time. So they get into a kind of like in a meeting, they'll get into a kind of panic mode and sort of shut down, and therefore can't be their true authentic self. So when I talk about honesty, that's what I'm talking about. But yeah, we've somehow, this has created the opportunity for people to be who they really want to be in a lot of terms, I think.
Yeah. And it's created that shared experience, hasn't it? This is the reason we take people away on away days and we do team building events, so that they can go through an experience together, and then it reinforces relationships, it builds trust. We had that for all of us. Everybody had that shared experience. Everybody could relate in some way to a pandemic experience. And I think that that's really, you know, we're probably not going to see that again in our lifetimes, are we? It's like a World War episode, isn't it? Yeah, fingers crossed. So I think that platform has given us the ability, and I know from a kind of working on a strategic leadership team, we spent hours together each day that we would never have spent in normal times, and it did really reinforce those relationships. It built our communication, it helped us to take better decisions. So that's a really interesting platform to explore, isn't it? And we've worked with our teams to give them all a facilitated session post coming back. So we worked through last autumn, and obviously we've come back, we've gone home again. Hopefully we'll be back in the office again soon. But we wanted to give teams that space to kind of reflect on how was it for us, what were the good things and what were the bad things, and do a bit of processing, a bit of recovery, but also a bit of regrouping as a team to say, okay, right, what are we going to keep, what we're going to take forward, because we thought that was quite important, that we didn't just kind of step away and pretend it hadn't happened to us. We need to take the learning from it, don't we? Definitely.
One of the things that keeps coming back to me, I think the author's called Breen Brown, and she talks about daring to be vulnerable. And I think, you know, I think intellectually I got that, but actually you had to be vulnerable. You had to be honest with people, more than relentlessly honest, because we were all working remotely, and then we worked in a hybrid way. And I think your comment about someone in the chat just posted that it helped people become more productive, more capable, more aware. Paradoxically, the more we were able to be, the more we were able to do. That's kind of a theme for me. If you're feeling comfortable in your own skin, and as a team you're feeling comfortable and you're relating and connecting well, I think that means your productivity goes through the roof, but also you do meaningful, productive work.
Yeah. I think that also Laura has commented in the chat, Carolyn, that ambiguous was the missing A. you weren't sure about. I think
Thank you, Laura.
I think the whole conversation about that authenticity and a sort of buzzword at the moment is that psychological safety, isn't it? Which I think it was it Project Aristotle? I don't know if anybody's read that research, but Google did some research around what is it that creates high performing teams, and they looked at a variety of things that we would all assume created high performing teams, and actually what it boiled down to was this concept of psychological safety, where people could argue, people could debate, people could be honest, but that it was a safe place to do that. And actually that disagreement and that vulnerability created much better performance. But when I'm thinking about the sort of emotional journey through change, pre-COVID, you know, the kind of the training that we will have all, anybody that's been on any management training will have come across the change curve. And actually the change curve was not founded from a management consultancy perspective at all. It was studies around how people responded to the news that they had a terminal illness. So I think we should be very careful translating some of that into being told that your job's going to change. It does not feel like they're on the same level. However, I did do a video on it at the start of the pandemic because I lost my dad to COVID on the 3rd of April. So it was very soon after the first lockdown. And so there was then a sudden kind of much more emotive response where the change curve, I did relate to it more than I had done before. But I've always treated it with a bit of pinch of salt, because I think there's something a bit dangerous about a tool that just sort of summarizes a series of complex emotions in, you know, a diagram. And I know it's always helpful to simplify things, but people don't go through things in that order. People are bringing their whole selves to work. So what one person might find incredibly exciting and liberating about a change, another person might find very stressful. Yeah. And I always say with those sorts of tools, to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it's very easy to just blanketly almost dismiss the emotional impact of change because, well, there's a graph here and that's where you are on it. So because you're in denial, I don't really need to engage with you. And yet I think during the pandemic, partly because of that shared trauma, because it did affect everybody, it affected everybody in some way, I do think that we were more accepting of the emotional journeys. We knew that there were days that some of us would be all right and some of us wouldn't. And I really hope that we can keep a little bit of that, because I think it was a much more, the principle of the learning behind the change curve, which is we'll all react to this emotionally and there's a process to go through, I think really came to life in a way without needing the graph. That was a ramble, but I don't know what your reflections are of that, because it just feels like we were more accepting of emotional impact than we would be during a normal change program.
Yeah, and I think we gave people more space. I think your point about the change curve is really pertinent, and it's interesting because recently they've looked at, there's a similar model about stages of grief, isn't there?
Yeah.
And they've recently said actually this isn't a helpful model to help people understand, because you don't move through stages of grief in a linear sequential fashion. You can be here and then here the next day and then back here again, and that can go on a very long time. And now the thinking on how we support grieving is changing because of that. And I think we need to be, it's very similar to the change curve. We need to be conscious that somebody might be in that denial phase. They might move out of it and start to get to grips with things, but then they could get set back by something else. Yeah. And we did give people more time and space to help them respond to that. And I think that's something about how we build that normal level of compassion into our everyday organizational lives. How do we, because people always have crises going on behind the scenes, yeah. And we get very good individual, like, often I find you'll have excellent support from a line manager. Your line manager will be very supportive in that space. But beyond that, people don't really feel brave enough to share with the wider organisation, with their other stakeholders. So they might still have to feel like they've got to go along to big meetings and act as if nothing else is going on in the background. And if we can build some of that permission in to be a human being and be able to say, actually, today I'm having a hard day. This has happened to me. So I just want you all to know that, but let's get on with the meeting now. That's really powerful. And I think that helps us to keep that kind of element of supporting people as human beings with lives behind the scenes in our day-to-day work, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on so many things there between you, Lucy, and actually, Carolyn. I think for me, it's a bit ironic. I've just forgotten your name there because I was talking about attention. So often we talk about mindfulness, and I'm not a great fan of the concept of mindfulness. I think it's a good concept, but I much prefer attentional awareness. And you know, I think that whole space that you describe, for me, was very important for everyone, because firstly, they could begin to attend to themselves, to listen to themselves, to observe themselves, to sense what's going on, because I think that's so important. With an awful lot of people, myself included, in life over time, just you lose touch with who you are, with what's going on. So even though you may have stress symptoms, you would be, as I think you said, in denial about that. Or you're like the frog in the boiling pan of saucepan. You know, you've just got used to that level of hypervigilance. And actually it's stress, and then you burn out, and it's incumbent on us all to give each of us the space to kind of attend to ourselves. You know, how are we? And there's a great guy I work with called Andy Knox. I'm going to do a call out to Dr. Andy Knox in Morecambe Bay, because he does his meetings, and he starts his meetings on MS Teams, and he says, how are you? Let's start the meeting. How are you? And then he has usually a funny kind of like I can't remember what he said this week, but it was something like, what was your best ever freebie? But he breaks the ice. You get to know how each of us are. People have become very honest. They've begun to dare to be honest and say, well, it's not been that great this week. And you know what? That gives license to everyone else to be a bit more true to themselves too. And it actually triggers people to look at, in a positive way, to look at attending to themselves. How am I really? That's so important. But that attentional revolution that I think we need is also about attending to our colleagues as much as our loved ones. And I think the pandemic really enabled us to do that in a way that we've never done before, as we've already said. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other one was that I'm a great believer in the Stoic philosophers. And one of the Stoic philosophers, I think it was, it's probably Marcus Aurelius, in his meditations, he talks about, and they all talk about, one of the key things about Stoicism, and it's not a stiff upper lip thing at all, it's a very real practical philosophy. What's in our control and what's not in our control. And that kind of attention to what we're able to control and what we're not able to control is so important. And just, I think you've kind of talked about bringing the whole self to work. And I think that attentional awareness, whether we call it mindfulness or not, but it's actually, you talked about compassion, Carolyn, and I think compassion starts with really checking in with yourself first. I don't believe you can be compassionate without being compassionate to yourself. Kindness to yourself is fundamental. But then from there, you can actually more easily be compassionate towards others, I think. And therefore that whole attentional focus should be on how am I, and being kind to yourself and giving yourself license, but actually also being kind to others and being there for others.
Thank you. So we have a comment from Paul, who I do know Paul's been a speaker previously on our other events, saying that the trick is, how do we hang on to this better way of working? Because this week's rush back to the office is a worrying sign that once the emergency is really over, will we just return to zero? And how do we prevent this from happening? And then we've also got a follow-up comment from Laura Davis saying that in the organisation that she works with, there's a definite split between those who miss the office and those who preferred working from home. And I think it is a challenge, because for me, I mean, I'm a bit of an in-between. So I have enjoyed working from home and I've got a lot done, but I do accept I don't have kids. I've got quite a nice environment to work from home in. It's, you know, I don't have a lot of the challenges that many people do. I do live in a bit of a zoo. I've got 4 different types of pets, so there is a bit of chaos there. But we had a team away day this week where the whole team came together, and it was very powerful. And we aim to do that at least once a quarter. And I do do. So I think there is something about that hybrid. But I guess the theme for this call really is about that humanity. And I think that the risk of going back to the office is that we go back to the professional mask. I think it's not where you're working. I think it's the authenticity of your relationships. And there was something about working from home that was human. There was something about taking that mask off and being accepting of people's whole lives instead of just you know, their contribution to work. Laura, you made it with your with your power outage and internet troubles. So Laura is a coach, as I said at the start of the call, and works very much with individuals around things like, you know, improving their performance, their well-being, meditation, resilience. So I'd love to hear your reflections, because your perspective will be very much from that individual's perspective. What patterns are you seeing in how people are sort of bringing their humanity into their work life in a way that perhaps they didn't do before?
I suppose what I have seen, and thank you for having me, and apologies, it's almost self-inflicted, the changes. We all complained about a pothole in the road, which then caused them to do something to the road, which then damaged all the power for everybody on the street. So apologies. It is that's more accepted, isn't it? The fact that these things happen and we've got used to these things. And as a mum with 3 kids, lockdown was extremely difficult for me, as was working from home. However, I'm used to working from home, normally working with people and delivering online. And the individuals I've worked with who range across all sorts of sectors, to me, it's dependent on who they are as an individual and whether or not they enjoy socialising and they see work or they get their satisfaction from the element of that social aspect at work, or whether they get their satisfaction from getting the job done. And they're not exclusive by any means, but there are some people who love going into the office. They like their little walk at lunchtime, going out for something to eat and having a chat. And other people are naturally quite happy sat at home in a room, not speaking to anyone. And of course, actually, that's not good for those people. And we know that we need social interaction. There is actually a study that's linked to being around people and being happy, your level of happiness. And one of my clients, who is a extreme introvert, absolutely loved sitting at home and in between maybe building his Lego and not speaking to anybody and occasionally going out for a solitude walk. And then he realised that what he really missed was the journey into work, the hustle and bustle, and that to enjoy the quiet, sometimes you had to have the loud. And I think that is an interesting concept, that people who perhaps thought they were better off at home have found themselves quite lonely. What I have seen, though, is this, you know, as people have gone back into work, that human side hasn't changed. That people, although we find it easier almost to have and be more open with who we are over Zoom and Teams, actually people have gone back into work with the less almost professional attire. People are wearing things more comfortable because they've got used to that, and they still get their job done, and that's okay. And actually they know people almost better than they did before. You know, oh, I didn't know you had children, or I didn't realise you had to care for your mum on a regular basis. And what did you do during lockdown to keep yourself sane? And so there is this greater understanding, which has created so much care and compassion. But also organisations are coming to me to say, actually, we want to look after our workforce. We value the people more than we ever did because they've been on this journey with us. We don't want people sending emails at 10 o'clock at night because, you know, they're at home and they can. We want people to recognise that balance is important. So more and more organisations recognising the well-being of their individuals, thinking, let's think about how we make lunchtimes better, how we bring in mindfulness, how we teach self-compassion. And yes, the comment I've just popped up there, lots of people started jobs, never actually physically met people. And that's strange. And I've done that myself with people I've worked for. Very recently, I realized I knew this person so well, never met him really, yet I have such a deep connection with them. And of course, once we can get over that barrier, I think that is a way forward that actually we shouldn't let go of. We shouldn't let go of that connection we've created through what was a horrendous situation for us all to be in, or certainly most of us.
Most of my team started in the pandemic, and we've had 2 away days in the last 18 months. So when we had our away day this week, most of the people there have only met once before. But it did feel nice. It felt like there was a connection. But I think it does depend on organisations. It depends on that level of psychological safety. Because Karen has rightly pointed out in the chat that in some instances, what it's actually done is created quite task-orientated, transactional conversations, rather than that meaningful side. So it is very varied. I think the organisations that we've spoke to and worked with during the pandemic that have done well are the ones where it has been more meaningful. And I think that's the lesson, isn't it? How do you, when you're about to go through a change that's, not a global pandemic, but still something that's unsettling and uncertain for people, how do you create that environment where people are checking in with each other and are building strong relationships rather than just focusing on the task? I don't know if you can all see my rabbit in the background.
I can. Gorgeous.
She's just jumped up on the back of the couch there. So
that's lovely.
This is what I mean. I might not have kids, but there's plenty of chaos in another way. Four-legged chaos in my house. So David, any reflections from you on all what we've talked about?
Well, I think one of the things that Karen says, which in the chat, which I think is really interesting, about conversations being very transactional and task orientated and missing those spontaneous conversations. I think that was recognised in our work networks very, very early on, because a lot of this synergy and innovation and creativity came from chats at the water cooler, if you call it that, or going to make a brew in the kitchen, and you would start talking to someone about, I'm struggling with this project, and someone else would chip in. And actually that informal network sometimes is much more powerful and more stronger. I mean, I'm not an OD person. I'm interested to hear what Carolyn and Laura think about this, but the informal networks are much stronger and more, and often unleash a lot of innovation, a lot of insight, a lot of creativity. And what we found early on is that we would just need to kind of replicate the brew, going for a brew online. So you'd literally ring just MS Teams or Zoom someone and just chat to them. Not, I'm going to make a brew. Would you like to have a coffee? Can we have a quick chat? So there was a culture in our workplace of wellbeing champions who created what they called a wobble room on MS Teams, and that was kind of where people would go and just sound off if they were feeling a bit like, and that seemed to benefit an awful lot of people. And there was also a kind of culture of messaging people to say, look, can I have a quick chat? And actually going to get a brew and sitting there with a cuppa and just chatting, not just informally, but then you would kind of chat about an issue. And I think someone said, and I can't remember, but there was this kind of very powerful connectivity that was made where relationships were strengthened. And I think that is going to happen moving forward. There were work colleagues who I never made connections with that I did over the pandemic. And so I've seen the value of them, they've seen the value of me. And the paradox, the more remote we were working, the stronger we became and the closer we became. So I think that's quite powerful. The other thing I think about, and you touched on this, was the introversion and extroversion challenge. So I'm a great Myers-Briggs fan. I'm also an INFP. I'm a classic introvert. I love my own space. But actually, I know myself enough to know that I need the synergy, the spark of connection. And we just arranged to meet people. When we came out of the stricter regulations, it was like, let's meet for a coffee at Costa or Starbucks. I've got this project, I need to pick your brains. And I think that really worked well. And I think that informal ability to say to people, help in a kind of gentle way, was quite useful. So those are my initial thoughts. The meaningful interactions increased for me personally. And I think that's something I definitely want to continue with and broaden. That thing about being vulnerable, daring to be vulnerable and open up to people comes with caveats. Clearly, OD people like Carolyn would probably recognize that and say that. But I think you could also just kind of like be more daring. We can all be more daring as a result.
Yeah, I think there's a real need to kind of change the way we do things, really. I think Karen's points are really pertinent, especially around people who've started with our organisations when we've been working remotely. Or in the case of my organisation, we're now moving forward in permanent hybrid working. So we'll never be back in the office for most of us 5 days a week. Some roles have to be. Some of our field ranger posts obviously are out in the field 5 days a week. But for most office-based staff, it's going to be a hybrid of 2 days, 3 days split. We no longer have the office space because we've leased a significant portion. So there's one of our biggest challenges at the moment is creating that informal space, and we've not cracked it yet. I'm looking at an engagement plan for this year at the moment, and what we're really trying to build in is those coffee corner moments where you're in a kitchen and you're just having a bit of a chat. And we need to crack induction as well. We've really lost our way with induction at the moment, because we used to have a brilliant system where people walked around the building and spoke to people, and you automatically bumped into most people you need to see. Then you went out to the other buildings and saw people and had a lovely trip around the national park. And we've not been able to do that virtually. It's not quite the same sitting on a Zoom call with somebody talking about their work, is it? It's far more formal. It's far harder to plan it in. It's not as spontaneous, because often I would bump into a new starter in the kitchen and have a chat to them there, really, and that would be quite nice. For me, a lot of this centres around permission and pace. We've got to give ourselves the permission, or leadership teams have to give teams the permission to take the time out to do this informal stuff, and recognise that if it is going to be in a virtual space, it's harder for people to feel okay about it. I think it's a lot easier when you're sitting in an office with your manager beside you to say, oh, there's an event on in the boardroom today. I'm just going to drop down for half an hour because I'd like to go and hear about this project. And your manager would say, yeah, great, that's good, off you go. If you're sitting at home on your own with a big, long to-do list and you've maybe only spoken to your manager once that week, it's harder to pick up the phone and say, oh, I'm so busy, but I really want to go to this session. So for me, it's about I talk to our managers a lot at the moment about permission, giving permission, and that's a real theme. And we talk a lot at the senior leadership team about pace and how we can free up people to feel okay about having those spaces in their day to do these things. We want to get more people out to the park this year on guided walks. We'd like people to see our projects in action. And that means freeing them up for at least half a day from their normal working week. And it sounds easy, but when we're all working with a backlog of work that stopped during the pandemic, for us, that's a lot of practical work. We've since had a couple of storm events, which have then increased the works we have to do out in the park again. It's really challenging because people feel very under pressure to get through that workload. So these are two themes that we're working on at the moment. And as I say, we haven't cracked it yet, but we do have to recognise if we want to protect some of these things and take them forward into the new world, then we have to change how we do things a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree that it is that expectations upon people, isn't it? And changing the culture a little bit around what it is when we're going through huge change within our personal lives as people go back to work and then they're back at home again. So readjusting our routines is difficult. But then the change that is happening within organisations as a result of the pandemic, or because actually they found that things can be changed because of the pandemic, they've sort of come to this realisation that they need to do things to move their organisation forward in different ways. And we do need to almost think about what we expect from our workforce and recognise that it's okay that creating these corridor conversations or these coffee conversations is an important part of working with people and productivity. One of the things I often talk about is Don't forget that we solve problems using our creative mind. And to do that, we need to be able to have fun. We need to be able to interact with people. And we can't do that. And if we are, laden with a to-do list, and we're starting to feel like there's no end, and we're starting to feel demotivated, then actually going away and doing something completely different will mean you go back to what you're doing with a higher energy level. And I think that realization within organizations with people and managers to say, do you know what? Go for a walk, take a break, join that meeting, do something different, because you'll expand your mind and you will go back feeling better.
I just want to jump in there because I applauded you talking about fun. I genuinely think, I'll reference my yoga classes because that's probably more powerful. People come to a yoga class and think, oh my God, I've seen someone on Instagram and they can put their legs behind their head. I'm really stiff and I can't even meditate for a nanosecond. So they come in with this kind of sense of a low self-esteem and low expectations. But actually, if you start a class with fun and people enjoy it, it's so much better. And that applies to the workplace too, just having a bit of creative fun can kind of create more creativity in its own way. But there's another word I wanted to just share because I think this is so important too, and that's curiosity. It's linked to me for fun. Being curious about why did you think that, rather than the classic conditioning of, fight, flight, freeze. Someone said something, being defensive, actually being more curious about why someone's saying something that's at odds with what you think could lead to greater insight, more innovation, and definitely more creative progress. And curiosity, I think, did come out and did arise in the pandemic because people were genuinely curious about how to be, how to do. And I saw a lot of people working out. You talked, Laura, about routines. The home routines that people developed and worked actually created opportunities for them to move more, to be more creative. And they need to carry that back into the workplace if they're going back, if they're not doing hybrid work. But curiosity, for me, is fundamental as well as fun.
Yeah, and we do say that. We say, dial up your curiosity and dial down your judgment with any situation if you can, because you just don't know what someone's going to say or bring. And it could be something, actually they had a terrible time during the pandemic. They're now suffering from depression or anxiety. And therefore we've got to be really curious about that and find out what we can do to help them and how we can bring them back into work, enjoy being part of, that environment, which fundamentally we know people, organizations having a hybrid approach, there's going to be not everybody in the office. So you won't get the hustle and bustle, but you will get a different environment to work in. And I think that is crucial as well, because sitting in your office 5 days a week and then moving into your living room, which can be your office as well, that becomes difficult whether you're working out. Actually going into a different space can create so much creativity and is just generally good for you.
And I think we need to support people through a bit of self-reflection on what kind of environment they are looking for, actually, because you've nailed it there, Laura. We can, in my organisation, we can no longer offer a hustle bustle workplace 5 days a week. There's benefits that come with that. I quite like the fact there's fewer people when I go in, so I tend to have longer conversations with people, whereas I couldn't possibly stop at every desk beforehand. So there's positives and negatives, but I've recently had a team member who's moved on and she said, I just really need to be in a workplace where I am in 5 days a week. I don't want to work from home anymore. I need to be in somewhere where there is a buzz about the place and it's not going to be like this here anymore. And I said, no, it's not, to be honest with you. It's going to be different. So I think we need to be brave about having those conversations with people about, first of all, we need to understand what are our organisations going to feel like. There needs to be some decision taking around that. We ran a consultation with staff around that last year and said, what do you want, before we took the decisions around leasing some of the building and things like that. And overwhelmingly, most people who were able to in their roles came back and said, we want hybrids. So we already had that kind of baseline. But obviously that's, there are still some outliers who do want to be in more regularly. And we've always supported people if they felt they wanted to have a desk in in our office spaces 5 days a week, but they're in the minority now, and it does make for a quieter place. So I think organisations have to go through that thought process, and from the forums I'm connected into in the Northwest, certainly I can see a lot of local authorities going through that at the moment, or who've just been through it last year. But then we need managers to feel confident about having those chats with people and not feeling like it is a failure if someone decides actually it is a different organisation, things have moved on, I do need something a bit different now. It's not a failing on anyone's part, it's just honesty, isn't it?
Definitely. We've got an interesting comment in the chat from Paul around pace, and prior to the pandemic, there was this sense that working at pace was the only way, and then that's been reinforced by the pandemic. But we do need to think about how sustainable this is, and think we need permission really to take time and properly think things through. I definitely have personally felt that, and because we are, although we focus on the public sector, we are a private sector organisation, and a lot of our work in the first lockdown, so just after my dad died, a lot of our client work went on hold, because naturally our organisations were very much focused on making sure that they could respond to the pandemic rather than long-term organisational change, which is what we do. So I had a bit of an enforced period of grief, in a sense, where I had to stay at home, and often people talk about grief as, that anger that the world is carrying on as normal, which I didn't really have that, because the world certainly wasn't carrying on as normal, and what took my dad took the whole world with it. So there was this sort of enforced sort of quiet period, and during that time it was a difficult time, but then there was a kind of reawakening of, hang on, there's a lot happening in the world here, and my job needs to change, because we've got to learn from this, because we can't go back to using things like Prince 2 and the change curve. We've got to really rethink it, which put me in a very deep reflective place of, what could that look like? I did the first draft of a book. I completely redesigned the business. We set up a new set of values. We set up a new recruitment process. So actually that enforced period of slow pace has dramatically changed my professional life. And I know that not everybody can do that, but I do think we've got to separate the being busy doing with the headspace. We've got stop valuing one over the other, which I know is very easy for me as a business owner, because I'm in control of my time, and much less easy for people in big complex organizations that, the NHS, people are getting sicker, not less sick. So, the capacity, and you, Carolyn, talked about things like storms and the actual capacity of work to do. There is a lot, but yeah, I'm curious on others' reflections on your personal experiences of where you've had to kind of withdraw, and how much value that's had.
Sorry, David.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, for me, I set up my business 4 years ago, and then I got pregnant, surprisingly. And then I went back to work after 6 weeks, because I had clients that I'd been already committed to work. So I took him in a sling, I fed him whilst I was delivering. And then the pandemic hit. So, my first 18 months in business, I was at home with children, trying to run things, wondering whether or not there was any more wine left at Aldi, because by the end of the day I was exhausted. But what it did for me, actually, it completely changed the way that I think. It was that time, that reflection time that I had, almost when the children, were almost going back to school, and we started to sit down and think about what was important to us as a family, was what changed me at work as well. And that realization that well-being is about a holistic approach, and that mindfulness can be done in a very busy day. And I've taught it to NHS workers to go to the loo, allow yourself time to go to the loo. A lot of people in the NHS don't, believe it or not, but actually to spend time while you're having a wee, just giving yourself some time to breathe as well. And actually 2-3 minutes of that slowing down your pace and really thinking can have a profound effect on the rest of your day and how you manage those stresses. So for me, and also development wise, I mean, I'm like you, Lucy, I do manage my own time. I do like to be very busy. But at the same time, I now, recognize how important walking is, and time for me, self-compassion. And I now teach self-compassion as part of what I do. And I think that is, that was the effect of me having time almost to sit back and not be, doing 60 hours a week almost, or expecting to be there on call all the time. So yeah, it's certainly changed the way I see things and made me better at what I do.
I was going to just jump in, if that's okay, because I have an image in my mind which is not a yoga image, it's more from archery. And the phrase that springs to mind for me is the arrow pulled back actually goes further and faster, and probably hits the target. But the connection that we make between the body, the breath and the mind, when you relax, you pause, actually it's a much better, what's the word, arrow shoot. But the point for me about this is that that pulling back and that creating a pause in our lives is so important. And for me, it comes to this point between reaction and response. We tend to react a lot to things, but we don't respond to things. And the response comes from the pause. And that's another word I like, the pause, P-A-U-S-E, not P-A-W-S. Pause are great because you can stroke them, and that gives you a pause, obviously. But actually creating space just for yourself, as you say, Laura, is absolutely critical. And we don't do it enough. And I think throughout the pandemic, that opportunity was there. And you were able to just like, okay, I've finished. I'm going to just make myself a brew. I'm just going to reflect on that meeting. I think probably one of the things to move forward for me and probably colleagues is this technology of reflection, as I call it. So I talked about an attentional need, but also a reflection need. And I think creating that space, it becomes actually a task in its own right. If you make that your task, it should be on your to-do list as much as on your visiting the toilet list. Yeah, create space regularly, not just as a one-off in the day, but throughout the day. Pauses is really, really important.
Thank you, David. Carolyn, I know this is something we've talked about. So how are you getting on with this, creating the space?
It is something we've talked about, and we've talked about, I think we talked about New Year's resolutions, didn't we, Lucy, and about how they're a bit unfashionable at the moment. But I suppose I've not had formal New Year's resolutions, but I suppose if I had a professional resolution this year, I've had 2 years where I haven't had that space, and it's 2020 was just ridiculous, basically, because we went through quite a crisis as an organisation, having had to close businesses. That impacted on our funding because we're only half funded by the government, so we had to make some rapid changes, which was very hard to do remotely. It did involve redundancies. It was hard on our teams, hard on our managers as well. So 2020 was tough. I was also homeschooling 2 children, so I didn't really get any time to think at all. And then last year was a bit better, but then we moved into last year we were all about putting in this hybrid working into practice, and we're just getting to the point of like right now we're there with it. Really, we've got a new updated office space and things. So I suppose this year my professional resolution would be to create that space for me and for my teams, and really try and encourage my leadership colleagues to create it as well, because it comes back to, I keep banging on about permission, but I think it's very easy to sit in a position of, in a leadership position. We've got a position of privilege, and as business owners yourself, Lucy and Laura as well, you've got the ability to create that space. But for somebody who's a team member who's not who's largely being tasked with things to do, that's really hard to create that time, isn't it? So it's down to our managers to create time for teams to have that thinking space together and individually as well, and recognize the value in it. So that's really one of my targets for this year, is to get better at it for me and others.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about the impact of the pandemic on individuals. Like this is a big question now, but if we were in charge of training the next generation of people leaders in the sectors that we work in, what kind of skills, what lessons do you think there are for managers? because I think that there was a big reduction in hierarchy. So we talked a little bit, didn't we, about that corporate mask coming off, about people building more authentic relationships with their teams, of it being a more human focused. But that took courage, I think, and that is one of the things that I do worry will go back once the emotiveness. So I don't think it's about necessarily the place of work, but once the emotion of the shared trauma of the pandemic starts to kind of calm down a bit, will we go back to this I am the boss, you are the employee kind of cultures and ways of working, which unfortunately in big, or so in small organizations like mine, you don't tend to have it as much, but in big complex public sector organizations, that, you know, the clue is in the word organization. We like to organize it, we like a structure and a hierarchy, and we like to all know what our roles are and where we stand. And I'm curious to know, how do we train the next generation of leaders to embrace this increase in authenticity and humanity that we think has been quite powerful, particularly when it's a period of change and instability? So I don't know if that's a big question. I don't mind who takes it.
I've done a little bit of this, I suppose, because one of the other things I do is leadership and well-being and leadership, and I'm seeing a lot of new leaders in the room, or people looking to be leaders. And, you know, when I start doing anything, I show a level of vulnerability straight away. I start talking about, not, you know, I don't tell people everything about me, but I certainly give them something which tells them more than what you see. And I encourage throughout any training for them to do that as well, and to have those conversations and to build those relationships, and it to be okay to say, you know, I'm going through something that's not very nice right now, or I feel vulnerable, and to admit if you've made mistakes. Whilst also, I mean, the other thing I do is that I do create that fun in a training room with people, so that they can recognize that we learn from lots of different ways. We don't just need to learn the theory, we need to learn how we learn and how people do things. And there are lots of ways to do that. So I think teaching new managers and existing managers that now we don't need the stiff upper lip. We can ask about people's children, families, and their mental health. And we can say, actually, you know what, I had a really bad day yesterday, and I cried because I couldn't do something. And that's okay as well. It's not a weakness, it's a strength, and it makes teams work better together.
Okay, so I agree with all of that, the compassion, the reflection skills. That one of my heroes, and I'd encourage you not to Google him, because he's an ex-naval SEAL called Jocko Willink, but he talks about extreme ownership, actually everyone owning, taking responsibility. And I love that word, it's the ability to respond, isn't it, really? But I also think about extreme vulnerability where appropriate, given all the caveats about people's, you know, states, but being the ability to be open and vulnerable. But the one for me actually is, and I was told this many years ago, and I've never seen it, and I think it's something we do need to look at. And as leaders, the ability to learn to discriminate between holding on and letting go. And this letting go and giving people their space to do what they need to do to be productive, to navigate and manage change, and at the same time to listen to them and actually not think, what someone said on the chat, one size fits all policy. I think it was Claire Broughton, and actually recognize that for someone, navigating change or managing change is going to be like a roller coaster scare ride. And for other people, it will be absolutely what they were born to do. But that holding on and letting go is so important, isn't it? I think, you know, holding on to the old ways of working, letting go of those, and actually beginning to see some new ways is absolutely critical.
I think that part about people as individuals is so crucial. And I think we we sort of, when we're kind of naive and immature in our management careers, you feel as though what you have to do is treat everybody the same. And there is something about treating everybody fairly that's important, but there is also something about just spotting people's fire and their strengths and their fears and pointing them in the right direction for them. Which I think takes a lot of courage. And that was something that happened a lot in the pandemic in the organisations that did well. They were like, well, do you know what? That person's good at that, so go do it. And that person, and job titles went out of the window. And lots of people ended up stepping up into roles. I spoke to a lady, I think I mentioned it to you, Carolyn, who had a very long career in local government around governance. You know, she was in charge of democratic services, corporate services. She lost her mum in the pandemic about a week or two after I lost my dad, and suddenly ended up in charge of the community response team. So the people that literally were thrown together from lots of different organisations, right, we've got to get out there and deliver food parcels to people who are shielding. So went from being in this very sort of command and control risk management role of, you know, make sure we don't break the law, to, do you know what, we all got to do what we got to do to make sure that people get fed. And she thrived in it and said to me, I'm finally doing what I came into local government to do 30 years ago, despite great difficulty personally. So I think there is something about, you know, just looking at people as people instead of their job title, and picking out what's really where is this person really going to shine, and let's let them do that instead of trying to force them into something because everybody has to be a robotic kind of replica of each other.
Yeah, and I think that's something that line managers can really take hold of, because part of giving organisations confidence that anyone can deliver is basically being a champion of your staff, isn't it? And trusting that they've got the abilities and giving them the exposure to situations where they can influence and deal with key stakeholders. So I think that that's something that is perhaps new to some managers who have felt like they've always got to be the hierarchical face of that part of the team. It's about inclusive leadership, taking people with you, talking through your decision making with those people so that they can learn from you. It's a bit of succession planning as well. It's about creating the next generation of leaders, isn't it? So we need to be giving everyone in teams the opportunity to influence and be exposed to different activities around the organisation, rather than just solely focused on one narrow part of their role, really.
Yeah. So there's something as well about in the pandemic, we all had to be leaders.
Yeah.
And I think there's this kind of distinction between the leaders and the kind of rest of the staff. Someone used the phrase about permission. I think it was you, Carolyn, but we in the NHS, I've heard a really interesting phrase, which is ask not for permission. It sounds a bit kind of biblical, but for forgiveness. In other words, just go on and get on with it, and then if it doesn't work out, let's help you sort it out. And I like that. I think encouraging everyone to recognize that regardless of where they are in the organizations, they have the space and the capability, and if they haven't, they'll be supported to be leaders in their own right.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about a kind of inward focusing, you know, about our own colleagues, our own leaders inside the organisation. And the other thing that I found really fascinating was that view outwards. And I know that all of us have worked in different aspects of the public sector. One of the things I found quite interesting, and that I do hope we keep, is that there's this challenge, I think, when you work with, and people use different terminology. Some people say customers, residents, service users, that varies from organisation to organisation. But because we work in these big institutions, there is a bit of a kind of power imbalance. Yeah. So we're often supporting people that need our services. And I think one of the things that many professionals have to do, and this is not a criticism, you know, I could not be a social worker, but part of keeping sane in those sorts of jobs is almost having this slight distance from the people that you're supporting for your own mental health and well-being. I think during the pandemic, some of that slipped, because I think that suddenly we were supporting people who we could relate to, because we were all scared. So regardless of job title, we were all worried about somebody's health. Some of us were worried about work. Some of us were worried about family members. Some of us had lost somebody. This impacted everybody. And I think that reduced that distance between the institutions and the people that we were looking out for. And that's something I'd really like to keep, but I don't know what the answer is to be able to keep that, but also, you know, take care of people's well-being and not get too emotionally involved in it. I just wondered what others' reflections were on that. Laura, I know you said you have to go.
I know, leaving early and coming in late. I'm so sorry. I have thoroughly enjoyed being part of the conversations, and I look forward to catching up with you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us, Laura.
Thank you.
So Carolyn, did you see that? Did you see a sort of a more people viewing the people that were customers or however you term them as almost?
Definitely, yeah. We had teams who were much more actively out there with our communities, really supporting them with some of the challenges. I'm sure people will have seen the news headlines about some of the issues we had in the park. We had an influx of lots of different visitors, and a lot of people hadn't really visited national parks before and didn't really understand it wasn't like Reading Festival. You can't leave your tent behind and all your rubbish. And that really hit our communities. It was quite stressful because there was antisocial behaviour at times. It obviously created issues in terms of the clear up after. Sometimes there were safety issues around things that people were having to clear up. And our team, we had an initiative which we developed with other agencies called Safer Lakes, which got a team mobilised and out doing regular patrols, doing all the clear up, and also talking to groups who weren't quite sure how to be in the space and that they couldn't camp on a farmer's field and things like that. And it was so lovely. We got some really lovely feedback from communities about how much that was valued by them. And I think that's work we hadn't done in recent times. And it's something that we're now we're still taking forward. We've still got our Safer Lakes patrols running for this season ahead. But going forward, we'll have to look at, you know, what do we continue providing and how does it fit in with our existing services? But certainly in that initial period in 2020, we had a lot of really grateful community members coming to us and saying, this is making a big difference. Thank you. We feel supported by you, which was a development in relationships, I think, a really welcome development. And that's been really delightful. But as I say, we now need to understand how that fits in. You know, we've had external funding to help us deliver that work. Once that's finished, how will we take it forward? How do we integrate it with our existing workloads and structures? That's the next challenge, really, because we don't want to lose that relationship and that goodwill. But we need to be able to fund it, essentially. So it's a bit of a tricky thing to take it with us and keep it going. I mean, volunteering has played a huge part in that as well. We've had some amazing volunteers out in the park supporting our communities. And again, that's a lovely relationship development. A lot of our volunteering historically is centred around fell management and looking after the footpaths and things like that. And that's what people think of when they think of volunteering for the park. But there's also the education piece. There's meeting somebody who's maybe not been for a walk in the park at a car park and who doesn't really know where to start, and having that conversation. There's talking to a community member who's a bit worried because the business have been overflowing and can you come and have a look? And I think we've got a new generation of volunteers who've joined us, and some of our existing volunteers who've changed how they volunteer with us to support that activity, and they've really enjoyed that. So that's going to be a really key part in how we take that forward. So yes, we have seen that, and it is interesting to see how much we continue to take the best out of those relationships.
Thank you. David, what have you seen in the NHS?
Oh, well, you talk about volunteers, Carolyn. I think we were really, really lucky. So throughout the pandemic, we had a network of GP practices, general practice GP practices, who have what are called patient participation groups. And those PPGs kind of coalesce around each of their GP practices and support, in theory, their GP practice. And in Pennine, we created a network, so they all would come together every year and they would have a kind of big jamboree. We would kind of like learn from each other. And they kind of helped us in all sorts of ways pre-pandemic. And then they could then coalesce around vaccination hubs to support, and became marshals, working with other agencies, but actually becoming equal partners with the vaccination hub work, which was really, really brilliant. And the volunteer effort extended to our staff, because there were kind of like very, very urgent, short notice requirements. The vaccination program absolutely required kind of admin staff who perhaps could drop some of their work and then go and support the GPs and clinical teams across Pennine. So staff volunteered as well, and that created a synergy and interaction between staff and people on the ground. Historically, a lot of people who are back office functions ended up in the front of shop, meeting people, the real world. So I started the conversation talking about Sean and Argyris and the model of the swamp and how messy life is, and how institutions are up on the hill and don't get caught up in the messiness. But I think in the pandemic that happened, and I think we would want to see that happen further. And I think it will, because most people now are adopting a hybrid way of working, and they are actually working in their communities. So there is much more of a shift away from that institutional kind of procedural, process-driven approach. And people are actually out in their communities. After this call, probably at lunchtime, I'll walk down the road and I'll bump into people. I'll talk to people on my lunchtime walk. And we'll talk about things that matter to them. And that's, I suppose, my final point, really. Finding out what matters to people is really critical for this. And we're not often very good at that. In the NHS, we've got a new service. We've designed it. We go out and consult with the public, but we don't actually start where they are. And I think the shift has been that now, even the most senior of leaders recognises, before we even design a new service or change a service, let's start with where people are. And I think that's a definite legacy of the pandemic. It was gestational before the pandemic, but the pandemic's really thrown that into sharp relief.
Yeah, I've seen a huge increase of that way of thinking in local government as well. So there is a lot more thought put into, I was working with a London borough who were putting a lot of thought into meaningful co-production of service change, instead of just, we might do this, what do you think? Actually bringing people in right at the start and helping the council to really understand what is the impact. And I think it's back to that when I said the clue is in the word organisation. We want to organise things, and I think particularly in local government, I'm not as close to the NHS, but there's been a huge amount of money taken out of it over the last 10 years. And the start of that journey was very much, well, we need to automate, we need to standardise processes. And whilst there's a lot of benefit in that, for 80% of the work, it can be sort of streamlined and made, and that's an important thing to do, because regardless of whether the money's going or whether, we still have a responsibility to spend it in the best possible way that we can.
Absolutely.
But I do think that we lost our way a little bit in the sector on that, and what we should be doing is aiming to standardise and really streamline processes for the bulk of the work, but the part where it's really needs that input and that, changing somebody's life, not just applying for a permit to go to the tip. I think we've got to sort of take different approaches between those two. But I'm seeing much richer conversations in local government around that, and I do think, again, the pandemic has helped with that, because all of that went out the window, and it was just, oh my God, this is our community. There was just a closeness there and an absolute need, which brings me to our next event, which will be about collaboration and partnership working. It was not an option, there was an absolute need to work with other people in the area, whether it was the NHS, whether it was the police, whether it was the charity sector. The one council who I worked with managed to set up an arrangement with their local football club to use the football grounds to build, in effect, a food bank overnight, with 40 different charities inputting. They needed a massive space so that they could build this production line of making sure they could set up food parcels and then deliver them to people that are shielding. And that scale of partnership working has not been seen before, even though we often have been playing at it for years.
Yeah, it's really strengthened the case for place-based management, hasn't it? And I think this is something that the Manchester boroughs are exploring already. but it is all, it's working beyond the organisational boundaries with other agencies as if you're all one. And I think we saw that working brilliantly in the Lakes. And I think that's food for thought for everybody really involved in local government.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. So is there any last thoughts, any last kind of reflections?
I've really enjoyed this. It's been fascinating to learn your experiences, Carolyn and Laura's. And I think you finished on a note which I'd like just to finish on, about place-based. And the NHS has come to place-based working quite late in the day, but the pandemic's really kind of shone a big light on the benefits of that. And as we move forward in the NHS in Lancashire and Cumbria, we will see the emergence of place-based care, integrated care partnerships and integrated services. And we started that journey with neighbourhood teams wrapped around GP practices, but I think that's going to accelerate now. And I think that's been a massive kind of diamond in the crown of the pandemic for everyone, just how that's worked. So a service like virtual COVID ward, where we look at pulse oximetry, we know that if people's oxygen saturation is very poor, that's an early indication that their COVID could worsen. And we set up at speed and at pace that service. And I think that was a place-based service. It was developed in partnership with partners, and that's won awards now. And that's the way to go forward, I think.
Thank you. Carolyn, any last thoughts from you?
I don't think I have anything further to add really, Lucy, but I've really enjoyed taking part today. It's always great to come along to these conversations. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's commented in the chat as well, because there's been some really great points raised there as well.
Thank you. So we've had a very, very rich conversation. As always, it's not an easy win. And I hope it's been helpful for everybody that's dialed in. I know we've not provided you with a crib sheet of what all the answers are going forward, but I think some of the thinking we've done around that sort of acceptance of emotions, that level of authenticity, what it might take to be a good change leader going forward in a post-COVID world. I think the thing we haven't said that definitely bears sort of strengthening at this point is our people expect more of us going forward, and that's a real driver for me, is that we can't go back. We can't go back to a world where it's normal for a change program to cost a load of money and take 3 years and not really achieve very much other than a load of highlight reports and a lot of bureaucracy. People really stepped up during the pandemic as individuals. They worked with rabbits and kids crawling around their feet and really stepped up to respond to the need. I don't think we can go back to a world where we become overly process driven and bureaucratic. We talked about psychological safety and permission to kind of fail and just kind of take risks a bit more, and being just more human and connecting with each other on what matters, rather than necessarily just transactional relationships. So lots and lots of rich, powerful learning there. As I say, we don't have all the answers yet, and I think we're all on a journey of figuring this out as we go. Some of the work that we do with organisations is kind of workshopping with staff and people around the organisation. We do something called culture mapping, where we really delve into, what are the systems and processes and how do they hold you back? What are the behaviours and how do they hold you back? And what kind of rituals and symbols and things do we see that might hold you back, which often uncovers a lot of the things that we're talking about here that are not quite so obvious at a first glance. But yeah, we're seeing a huge increase in people wanting to shape organisations from their staff perspective in a more purposeful way going forward, which is definitely very heartening for me, given my passion for doing this well and doing it right. So thank you so much to everybody that has dialed in. Our next event is in March. Charlotte will hopefully put the link in the chat, so that everybody can book on it. That is very much about that kind of slightly more outward focused collaboration, partnership, co-design, different organisations and partners coming together to make change happen for the benefit of the community, rather than this kind of siloed way that often we fall into as big public sector institutions. And so very, very much looking forward to that. We do have, so hopefully you'll all be on our mailing list now that you've joined an event, but we do have our new website launching soon, which has on it a lot more content around what we found as part of our research, what we found about what the key ingredients for good quality organisational change are in a post-COVID world, one of which is humanity, another is collaboration, but also things like the ability to take action, the resilience of people in the organisation, and very, very clear sense of purpose and what it is you're trying to change. So there's going to be lots more content on there around what all of that means, and white papers, and they're literally building it this week, so that's very exciting. I get to see the first draft of it next week, so yeah, we'll be sharing that with you very soon. The other thing, just to say to everybody while you're on the call, we are expanding and we are recruiting soon. So we've not got the adverts live yet. They will come out through the newsletter, so you'll receive them anyway. But if anybody on the call is thinking, oh, that sounds interesting, I might like to go and do radical change in public sector organisations in a scrappy little northern consultancy business, then please do feel free to reach out to me, and I can make sure that you get first sight of the adverts as soon as they go out. And yeah, I hope to see you all in March, and thank you so much to our speakers. It's been so insightful. Thanks for being so authentic and honest and sharing your stories, and yeah, we hope to see everyone very soon.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks
Everyone.